Thanks for coming out on a fairly nice evening, and we look forward to hosting these in the future. We can't do it without the help of many partners, and so we're especially grateful for the North Olympic Library System and all of the help that they lend so that we are able to host this series. We're also grateful to the Friends of Olympic National Park. If you enjoyed the refreshments or the coffee and the tea and the cookies, that's thanks to the Friends of Olympic National Park. They're a member organization, and they would love for you to join their organization as well. And then the Parks Cooperating Association, Discover Your Northwest, they provide some funding for the series, and so I always like to acknowledge them as well. So without much further ado, I would like to thank our speakers tonight, Dr. Ann Shaffer and Annabelle ByrneStrong, who are with the Coastal Watershed Institute, and I'll let them do a little bit more of an introduction of who they are and about the Coastal Watershed Institute. So thanks for coming tonight. It's great to see everybody, and we'll have Dr. Shaffer.
I'm Ann Shaffer, and I'm at the Coastal Watershed Institute. And thank you all for coming this evening. Annie ByrneStrong is our Nearshore Biologist-in-Training. So this is her first talk this evening. So I know you guys will be great for her. Before she dives into our topic, I did want to give just a quick orientation about us. We are a small environmental nonprofit. We're based here in Port Angeles. And our mission is to protect and promote and restore coastal cold water systems of our region. And we do this through a really innovative series of partnerships with scientists and managers and local community. So the other one of our foci is to educate the next generation of scientists and managers. And in particular, we're focused very hard on the next generation of leaders. We want to give them a really good understanding of really the issues that they're going to be grappling with once they graduate college and hit the ground. Because oftentimes what we see in reality is what people learn in college really has little reflect to what's going on in the world. And so we do this through a series of part-time paid internships. And it's a really innovative business plan where we take these undergraduate college students, primarily undergraduate, and we link them with regional and national experts, managers, scientists to address gaps that we know are in our resource management and science. And so over the last 30 years, we've had well over 100 of these interns through our program, and they're paid part-time internships as well. So before we go any further, I did just want to give some context. How many of you are familiar with the term nearshore? Oh, good. Woo. Jazz hands. Okay, so just for a context, when we talk about nearshore, we are talking about an area that's defined by both fluvial and coastal sediment dynamics in particular. So we're talking about the area from lower rivers, and that area that is tidally influenced in lower rivers. So it's not just the salt water, but actually that tidal bore, that tidal push. That's the upstream extent of nearshore. And then the nearshore extends out to a depth on a shoreline of 30 meters, mean level of water. So it's not a distance offshore, it's a depth. And it does include a number of habitats that people often don't think of as being in the near shore. So yes, lower rivers, also deltas, estuaries, feeder bluffs, riparian zones, both in lower rivers and along shorelines. And then our favorite tonight, kelp forests. And the reason these habitats matter, there's a whole bunch of reasons. But the one that I think is probably one of the most iconic are our salmon. And Annie will be talking in some detail about how important these habitats are and how complex they are for salmon. But it's also not just the salmon, but the whole system and that whole link, right? Right on up to from fish to whales. So it's a very important component to why we all love this area. And the other key component to our coastal systems are the tribes. And it's not just the cultural component, as I'm sure you all know, they're a very active manager, they're scientists, they're policy makers for our region. So for the talk we're giving tonight, a lot of the work is associated with the Elwha tribe, but we do have tribes all over Western Washington that use the resources that we'll be talking about this evening and also manage the resources and conduct the science. So just keep all of that in context. So with that, I'll stop talking and let Annie dive into the topic of kelp forests and mining. So thank you. And can we turn lights down? Is that yeah, because we got some pretty slides.
Thank you, Anne, for that introduction and that overview of the Nearshore. I'm Annabelle ByrneStrong. I am the Nearshore field biologist in training, and I've been at CW for about 6-7 months now, and I've been learning a ton from Anne. And again, I just want to thank her for everything she has to offer. So tonight we're going to be talking about the dynamics of kelp forest, forage fish, and salmon. And to start off, I just wanted to give a brief definition of dynamics. Why are we defining it? What does it mean? So dynamics are defined as a force or factor that controls or influences a process of growth, change, interaction, or activity. It's a really long definition, but it's really important to understand when we're talking about all of these different species in the nearshore and how they are interacting. So the first guild of species I want to give an overview of tonight is kelp. So kelp is large brown seaweeds, and there's a lot of different species of kelp, and they form these forest structures in the nearshore. So much like we see at Olympic National Park with our upper story cedars and our lower story salal and huckleberry, we see that in the aquatic environment as well, with floating kelp species like bull kelp and giant kelp, and then our understory species. They're a really common feature of our region's nearshore ecosystems, and they're very foundational for habitat, for food resources, and they can even alter the physical environment in our temperate oceans. Later in the talk, I'm going to be going over how these forests are in flux globally, and how we relate to that as humans. So this is just a brief overview of the global dynamics of kelp forests worldwide. So we can see it's kind of faint on the screen, but the cooler colors, so the red colors are showing rate of change, and the cool colors are a positive and the red are a negative. And if we zoom in to our region, I don't have a pointer, but we're right at the 0.0 mark. And that's really important to understand going forward. We want to understand where we are in this whole flux of kelp forest. So looking a little bit closer, this is a map of the North Olympic Peninsula and the coastline showing the floating kelp site level distribution and where we're seeing different kinds of floating kelp. So these are the really tall kelp like bull kelp and giant kelp. And we're seeing a lot of bull kelp near our area near Port Angeles. And that is the kelp that we're going to be going into depth on today is bull kelp. Important distinction, they're not the same. They have a lot of differences. Bull kelp is an annual species. Giant kelp is perennial, so that's a huge factor going forward. So going into that dynamic life history of bull kelp specifically. So kelp, it's a non-vascular plant, meaning it doesn't have a root system. So it gets all of its nutrients from the water column in its stipe, which is like that stem-like structure you see. And then it has its blades and its sexual part of the plant there. And then what it has that's really important because it's non-vascular is a holdfast at the bottom. It looks like roots. It's not. It's just holding on to a really cobbly substrate for dear life so it won't float away. And this is really important going forward for the talk when we talk about different kinds of sedimentation in the nearshore. Another really important part is that it is dimorphic. It's an annual species, like I had said. So it goes through a microscopic and macrophytic stage. So kind of like seeds from a tree, they descend in these zoospores and they germinate and they go down into the substrate and they hang out all winter. And then when spring rolls around, they rapidly grow. So they grow up to 30 meters tall. So that's kind of our measurement for the depth that we calculate for the near shore. And that's where these kelp are growing and how tall they get. So the kelp forest is dramatically changing based on the season. These are some pretty explicit photos of how bare bones our bull kelp forests are in the winter. This is winter 2020. It's like a graveyard. There's not a lot going on. The kelp is decaying. And then we flash forward to the summer. It's just like a highway of all these different species converging at once. Another dynamic when we're talking about kelp is how the kelp is interacting with other kinds of kelp. So we can see that the fleshy red algae really peaks in like the bull kelp's off season. So in the winter, because it thrives in a more light-starved environment, it'll actually kind of take over and have a higher population while that bull kelp, is died back for the season. All right, so the second guild of species I'm going to be talking about tonight are salmon. If you're from this region or if you've been here for a while, you know that salmon are very, very important to our culture and our ecosystem. And I just have here a diagram, an illustration of the different kinds of salmon in our region, and then steelhead trout down at the bottom. And I just put up the names in case you're from out of the area, if you're from Alaska or someplace else, giving the different names because they have a lot of different names. But for the purposes of this talk, we're going to be dealing with Chinook, chum, coho, pink, sockeye, and steelhead trout. So this is a distribution map of all the historical salmon runs in Washington state. And we can see how pervasive they are in the coastal region and the Olympic Peninsula and the Puget Sound. And they start to thin out a lot towards eastern Washington because we've got the Cascade Mountain Range, that's blocking a lot of the migration. But I want to note that the salmon make it all the way to Idaho. And it's not exhibited on this map because it's not of that state. And they're also obviously in British Columbia and Oregon. So they're quite pervasive species. They're all throughout the state of Washington, and they're really important for our culture. Now, going in a little bit to the dynamic life histories of salmon, just in case you're not familiar, they go through a really interesting history when they spawn. So the salmon, as we know, they are in the open ocean, and they'll come back as adults to spawn in their natal streams and watersheds. And they'll decide to lay in a gravelly substrate, and then those eggs will hatch into alvin, and they'll hang out in their streams for a little bit. And then once they get a little bit bigger and they become fry, they start migrating downstream as par. And then they'll hit the near shore in these estuaries and these deltas, and they keep growing, they keep getting bigger. And then eventually they make their way out into those kelp forests. And sometimes we've seen these salmon swim back and forth. They're just getting used to the idea of going to college, going to the open ocean. But as they get into those kelp forests, they grow, they become smolt. And then again, they're playing with the idea of not only being in the kelp forest, but then going out into the open ocean as adults. Once they're adults, they'll spend 3 to 5 years traversing in the sea, and then they'll come back and the whole cycle will start again, and they'll start spawning in their natal streams. So this is just an illustration. This image was taken by Dr. Ann Shaffer, just exhibiting how tiny these baby salmon are when they're recruiting to the nearshore. These are some chum, and these guys, they're in centimeters of water. They're really small. They're really fragile. They're not ready for the open ocean. And something I want you to keep in mind that as the kelp is growing, the salmon are also growing. And when the salmon are in the kelp beds, kelp forests, my apologies, they're undergoing a phylogenetic shift. And so they're transitioning from eating macroinvertebrates and zooplankton to eating other fish, like forage fish. So, how many of you have heard of the term forage fish? Okay, not that many of you. That's what I thought. So forage fish are also known as bait fish. These are the little fish that humans and animals have been eating since time immemorial. A common snack that I like to eat are anchovies or sardines. So those are also a kind of forage fish, but they're just not necessarily populous in our region. They're more popular in Europe. But these little guys, they feed on krill and zooplankton. So they're kind of bottom feeders, and they're found worldwide. And these are our regional species. We have sand lance, which is pretty easy to identify compared to the other two. It's very long, lanky. And then we have surf smelts and Pacific herring. The Pacific herring can have like a triangular face. So that's how you can tell the difference between those guys. And then this is a graph just showing the populations of the forage fish in our region. So you can see the green bars, those are surf smelt, the light blue is Pacific herring, and the orange is Pacific sandlance. So those are the most common fish you'll actually see when you're out snorkeling or boating. The likelihood you're going to see some forage fish is very high. I just want to note in 2010, we did have an influx of northern anchovy. They just decided to drop by. I know, it's pretty wild. We don't know exactly where they came from, but something about these fish that's really special is they are pelagic schooling fish. So they will make their way out into the open ocean as adults. So this is just a nice little diagram just showing you the forage fish function, again, at the bottom. And what eats forage fish? Salmon do. They're a really yummy snack. And then what eats salmon are seals, are killer whales. They're really foundational for the nearshore ecosystem. And where is this all happening? In the kelp forest. So yeah, at times you'll see all of these marine life in the kelp forest at once interacting. All right. So the dynamic histories of forage fish. This is kind of a longer section. But in general, I'm going to dive into each of these species specifically. The forage fish will lay their eggs in the near shore. And then as larvae, they will grow and change into juveniles in the kelp forests. And then as fingerlings and adults, as I was saying before, they will become pelagic. So they'll play with the idea, much like the salmon, of going out into the open ocean. But in their case, they go out in these big schools. So you'll see schools of like 1,000 herring out in the open water. So the differences between all of these species is really important, again, when we're talking about sedimentation, because forage fish, the surf smelt and the sand lance, they like to lay their eggs on these intertidal beaches. So on the top, we have the surf smelt. It's a spawning site. And you can see that they kind of like a gravelly substrate, as opposed to the sand lance. They like a really, really sandy substrate to lay their eggs in. So when it's high tide, these forage fish will come in, lay their eggs, and spawn, and then move away. And you'll actually find these eggs on the beach when you're walking the length of the waterway. And this is just an example of how tiny these eggs are. You can see that's a penny. It's kind of faint. But this is surf smelt spawning. And you can see the variable size in grain. So again, they like a little bit gravelier. They don't mind it as much, but those sand lance, they like a sandy sand. All right, so herring spawn is completely different. They have a very flary way of spawning. It's visible from the sky. So this is a picture taken by Dave Parks. He's one of our board members out on Hood Canal, and we call this a whitewater event. So what is happening is right before the herring are ready to spawn, they will gather in droves outside of the near shore. And then when they're all gathered, they'll come in and the females will start ferociously laying their eggs. And then the males will release their milt into the water. And that's what you see there. The females will lay their eggs on understory kelp, and it will stay there for about 2 to 3 weeks, and then it'll hatch and we'll have a bunch of larval herring in the near shore. This is a really fun event. We actually just posted a video on our socials of last year's herring spawning event, and you'll see seabirds dive bombing these whitewater events and seals going ham and eating all of those yummy, yummy herring. You can see how murky the water is. That's a photo by Tavish Campbell. And then this is just a really cool illustration of what these eggs look like. So these eggs have washed up in a high tide event. And on the left, you can see they're brown. So those are about ready to hatch. Those are larvae that are about ready to hatch out of the eggs. And then on the right, those are fresh eggs. So they're pearly white. And you can actually, if you squint really closely, near the water line, you can see these white droves of eggs just littering the shoreline on that fleshy red algae. Oh, and it's Dungeness, which is a local example. So this is a map of the spawning distribution here. I want to draw your attention to the purple area. So that is the gathering place for all those herring before they come in to those darker blue areas of where they'll spawn. And then you can see that the light blue and the oranges are sand lance and smelt spawning areas. They're quite pervasive here in the Puget Sound and in Dungeness. And then if we glance over to the Elwha drift cell, we can see that they're not as common. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. I want you to keep that in mind. All right, so now that we've gone over all these species individually, I just want to give you an overcap of the dynamics between them. So we want to think about how the kelp is changing seasonally, and that the salmon and forage fish are recruiting to their natal beds at the same time. And as the fish are growing, the kelp is also growing. So this is what we know. This is what we can see. But what don't we know? So why is seaweed around? Like, what are we doing? So our goal is to better understand how the dynamics of kelp forests, juvenile salmon, and forage fish communities all intersect in an ecosystem function contest and how we relate to these dynamics. So who is where, why, when, and how are we involved? So we're going to go over a couple studies tonight about how we've tried to answer this question. And to start, I'm just going to go over some of the hypotheses we had before we started investigating 30 years ago. It's been a long time. A lot of research has been done. And the first hypothesis we wanted to answer, just to be sure, is if there was actually a higher abundance of salmon and forage fish in kelp forests as opposed to that open water habitat. After that, we wanted to see if there was a higher abundance of zooplankton communities, because what do salmon eat? They eat zooplankton when they're juveniles. So we want to see if there was a higher abundance of these communities in the kelp forest versus the open water. Getting a little bit more into the nitty-gritty, we wanted to see how the juvenile salmon and forage fish use the kelp zones and how they differed by season. And then we also want to see how the juvenile forage fish and salmon interactions would differ in the kelp zones relative to and by species and season. So looking at the interactions between different kinds of forage fish and salmon. So how do we do this? We have a couple methods. The first one are our snorkeling surveys. I've done these. I did these this summer. They're incredibly fun, incredibly interesting, and incredibly effective because you're physically in the water with the fish. And so what we'll do As you can see, one of our workers has a clipboard. She is writing down every fish she sees and where it is in relation to the kelp bed. And what we'll do is we'll have transects of 3 snorkelers, first going out in the kelp bed. So someone very close to the shore, someone in the center of the kelp bed, and someone on the edge. And they'll swim out, mark everything they see on the way out. And then we'll hop over into the open water and we'll do the same thing coming back, looking to see if we can find anyone in a similar area in the open water. The second method that I'm going to go over tonight are our zooplankton drop nets. And so this is actually a seaweed design zooplankton net that one of our workers is dropping. And what this will do, it'll get a core of water and it'll catch everything as it falls down. And what we'll do is we'll bring it back up and we'll filter it, take all the debris out, and see what kinds of zooplankton communities are in that sample. And the last method that we use are our video analysis surveys. So we can see one of our researchers in the water with a GoPro, and that GoPro will be mounted on a stick as to not disturb the fish. And what we're doing is we're trying to capture different interactions because the memory is not so reliable when you're trying to identify where you are, what kind of forage fish, what kind of salmon, what are they doing? It's a lot to remember. And so what we do is we take videos and then we process them in the lab. And how we process them is we first identify if there was kelp present and where it was if it was present. So was it on the edge in the kelp or was there no kelp at all? And the second thing we'll do is see who's involved, what kind of salmon, what kind of forage fish, and we'll estimate the number of forage fish and salmon and bin them. And then the third thing we'll do is identify what interaction is occurring. So the first 2 you can see here, those are non-predatory actions. So adjacency, the salmon is depicted, it's bigger than those 4 forage fish swimming underneath it. And that just means that the fish are swimming in the same direction, not really paying attention to each other, but they're near each other. So it's a non-predatory interaction. And then the second interaction is intermingling. So similar to the first, except for the salmon's in the mix. You know, they're swimming with all of the forage fish in the same direction. And then the second 2, fast approach and successful predation, are predatory behaviors and interactions. So we can see this fast approach, the salmon is swimming really fast and he's freaking these little forage fish out, but he's not getting any catch. Whereas a successful predation is the salmon's had a couple forage fish for lunch and he has 1 more to go and we think he's going to get it. So the last one is the salmon successfully getting to eat a forage fish. So what are our results? What did we find? How do they relate to one another? So after we did all these snorkeling surveys, we wanted to answer the question, was there a higher abundance of fish in these kelp beds? And the answer was, for the most part, yes. With herring, salmon, and surf smelt, we did see a significant difference in the proportional presence. For sand lance, there wasn't. So this is an interesting thing that we need to look into and further investigate of why these sand lances are not as or significantly more common in the kelp forest. For the zooplankton, we wanted to know, again, about abundance, if there was a higher abundance of zooplankton communities in these kelp forests. And what we found was there didn't seem to be a significant difference in diversity or richness. These are box and whiskers plot. If there was a significant difference, they should be much farther apart. So we took it 1 step further because we were kind of confused by this. And we looked at phytally associated zooplankton results. So phytally associated zooplankton are zooplankton that rely on structure to survive. So by their nature, they are more common in kelp forests, and they are actually proven to be the preferred prey of these forage fish and salmon. And what we found is that, yes, there was more of this phytally associated zooplankton in the kelp forest. So does zooplankton abundance matter? In general, no, it is not a driver. But phytally associated zooplankton by its nature is more common in these kelp beds, and it's likely part of the story driving this habitat function. All right. So for our video analysis results, I just wanted to go over the fact that we only saw coho and chinook during the time of this study. Since then, we have seen different interactions with different species of salmon in the nearshore, but for this study, we're just looking at coho and chinook. So our question again was how these interactions of juvenile and salmon and forage fish changed based on species and season. So 2 factors. And what this graph shows you is the count of interactions, what month they're in, and who is interacting with who. And so what's important to take away from this slide is that we didn't see a lot of interaction before May, so we didn't even put it up there. But what we did see in June and July was a lot more interaction. And different kinds of interaction. It's a pretty diverse array of the kinds of interactions happening. And so after doing some analysis on this, we were trying to figure out how the predictors would define the interaction. And so what we saw was that herring and saline are more important for juvenile salmon foraging than surf smelt. So for some reason, those salmon were not preying on surf smelts. And the predation of the herring in particular is proof that the salmon is undergoing this phylogenetic shift. So again, transitioning from eating those macroinvertebrates and zooplankton to eating herring. And so also looking at this surf smelt phenomenon, we think it might be a sign of possible mutualistic schooling because there was a lot of intermingling happening, and again, not a lot of predation. Another thing that we looked at through this video analysis is what percent of the interactions were actually occurring in the kelp. And so what we saw were that 78% of interactions were associated with kelp and 100% of predations were. And so the kelp is signified by the green bars, and then the red is the non-kelp area. And so after thinking about that, thinking, oh, all these interactions are happening in the kelp and the predations are happening in the kelp, what part of the kelp is this happening in? And so we broke it down even further to see what kinds of interactions were happening in the kelp versus on the edge of the kelp. And so this has signified to us an important dynamic interplay between the salmon's predatory habits and their use of the edge of the kelp bed. Because what we saw is that a lot of predations were happening on the edge of the kelp bed. We think this could be because the salmon, they like a little bit of a run-up before they charge at those forage fish. And it's hard to do that when you're in the kelp, but you can do that coming into the edge of the kelp. So just to recap before we move on to our next section, looking at the different hypotheses and how we've answered them. Our first hypothesis was about abundance, the abundance of forage fish and salmon in those kelp beds. And we just found out that abundance changes outside the kelp bed with the exception of sandlands. So yes, we do have strong evidence that surf smelt, salmon, and herring all prefer those kelp beds, especially in their juvenile stages. The second hypothesis was that kelp forests would have a higher abundance of zooplankton communities as opposed to non-kelp open water habitat. And we were surprised to find out that zooplankton abundance is not a driver, but that phytally associated decapod larvae and harpacticoid copods were more abundant in those kelp forests. And because of this phylogenetic shift in the juvenile salmon, we think that it is driving coho and chinook abundance in those kelp beds. Our third hypothesis was that the juvenile salmon and forage fish use of kelp zones would differ by season. And yes, they did. Of course they did, because bull kelp forests are very seasonal. Bull kelp is an annual plant. And so there was a lot more interaction in the summer, and the habitat became increasingly complex as all of these fish were growing into their adult stages. Our fourth hypothesis was that juvenile forage fish and salmon interactions with different kelp zones relative to and by species and season. And yes, we did see a seasonal component to the interactions. The first interactions differed than the interactions later in the season because, again, those salmon are undergoing that phylogenetic shift. They're starting to predate on herring later in the season. And smelt, for some reason, is not on the menu. We have to investigate that further, but we have some good ideas of why. Okay, how's everyone feeling? It's a lot of information. All right, so the last part of our talk is about us, the humans, yes, and how all of these species are extremely sensitive to anthropogenic forces. That wasn't supposed to happen yet. So anthropogenic, if you're not familiar, anthro means Latin, or means human in Latin, and we're in the Anthropocene right now, so that's the next geological age, and that's been very influenced by humans. And so when we talk about anthropogenic forces in the environmental field, usually it's not a good thing. And so how are these negatively impacting our kelp forests globally? And again, I just wanted to bring up this map of the flux in the kelp forests around the world, but then also zooming in again, as opposed to the distribution map earlier, this is showing the mean autocorrelation. So it's the health and growth of these kelp forests in our region. And it's a little bit confusing, but the warmer colors actually indicate growth, and the cooler colors indicate a poor health in the kelp forests. So in our region, we're doing pretty well. We can see a couple unhealthy forests in Port Townsend area and a couple on the coast. But for the most part, we're holding steady. We're definitely not as in decline as other regions in the world. But what could change this? There's a lot of things. And the first one I'm going to talk about tonight is petroleum in kelp. So petroleum is very pervasive. It's very immediate, and it will slow the growth of our kelp dramatically by damaging the membranes and smothering the plant. So this is an image of the Tenemaru oil spill. This is off the Strait in 1991, and we can see how thick that oil is covering the bull kelp. And we can think to ourselves, maybe the plants don't like that very much because plants photosynthesize. And so there is a study done by Liam Antrim from Battelle, which is now known as PNNL, in 1995. So this is 4 years after that oil spill. And he was looking at the control kelp versus the different kinds of petroleum treatment. And so on this graph, you have on the left side is the stipe growth, and then on the right side in the shaded area is the blade. And we can see that the control, it's growing pretty well. And then all of a sudden, we do some petroleum treatments on it, and it diminishes its photosynthesis rate. And we can see that through the respiration rate. So not only does oil affect kelp, it also dramatically affects our salmon and our herring. This is a study looking at the speed and body lengths of juvenile salmon and herring when they're exposed in their embryos, so at the egg stage. And I want to draw your attention to the herring. This bar here is indicating a very low exposure. And we can see or a very low exposure, actually. It's hard to tell on there. But on my screen, it's very clear that the very low exposure has a steep decline in the speed and body lengths of those herring. And then in the salmon as well. So it physically slows the fish down. It affects their spines and their organs. This is the heart, and it is completely moved. So it has a really dramatic effect on these fish. The next thing I'm going to talk about is stormwater and non-point pollutants. So we all have cars. I'm assuming we live in the wide open spaces. And we can see this car is driving through this rain event. And all of this water is washing oil and heavy metals from the braking system into these irrigation stormwater conveyance systems. And that's coming out into the near shore. And so we can't really walk along the beach in our urban or developed areas without seeing some of these stormwater conveyances. And so this was a study done by Chow et al. And this is looking at stormwater exposure in juvenile coho. This is a local study. They took their samples from Seattle stormwater. And we can see on this axis the time to moribund based on the exposure. And it's a matter of minutes for these juvenile coho. When I was reading this study, getting ready for this presentation, I was interested to find out that even after they exposed the salmon, the ones that they took out and put in hospitable water still died. So even a brief exposure can be fatal to these juvenile salmon. Switching gears a little bit, and we're going to be talking about sedimentation and how that has a real impact on our near shore. We have a local example, the Elwha River dams. So we have the Elwha Dam and the Glines Canyon Dam, both installed in the early 1900s. Thankfully, both of those dams have been removed, but what they did was that they trap a bunch of sediment behind them in those reservoirs. And what that does is it diminishes the amount of fine sediment we find in the near shore. So above is a kelp forest map before those dams and shoreline armoring were implemented. Now, shoreline armoring, I don't have a picture of it up here, but those are those big boulders you see on the beaches that are meant to protect bluffs or property development from erosion that is vital for the near shore. So this is pre-dam and shoreline armoring. We can see how small the kelp forest population is here in the Elwha Driftsell. And then post, this is 1989 to 2004, this is the kelp coverage after those are installed. So what's happening here? It looks great, right? We're like, oh, more kelp, haha. But what's happening is that the sediment is trapped up in that watershed. So none of it's getting delivered into the near shore. That's not good. And so when we're looking at the sedimentation processes and when we let out a ton of sediment from those dam removals, we can see here a really dramatic photo of the first stages of those dam removals by John Gusman. We can see a lot more sediment getting delivered to the near shore. Now, this is not directly after the dam removal. There was a lot more sediment getting delivered. This is in 2019 after a storm event. And so this is a naturally occurring process where a lot of sediment would normally be delivered into the drift cell. So this is a good thing. We're seeing all that finer sediment come down and be distributed in the Elwha drift cell. But it does have an impact on those kelp forests that were thriving with the human impediment of those dams. And so we see a steep decline after 2012, where the kelp forests, they're pretty much wiped out in the Elwha Driftsell. But then, moving forward a couple years, we start to see a resurgence of them coming back to their historical areas. And so why the kelp? Like, why would we want to get rid of the kelp? We don't want to get rid of the kelp, but we want to restore the historic natural processes. And by doing that and getting that finer sediment down river into the water, we're seeing a difference in our surf smelt spawning and our suitable habitat. Because again, those forage fish, they really like a sandier habitat. And with that armoring and those dams in place, we didn't have that. So this is before dam removal. This is 2008. This is a seaweed study, and we are identifying suitable, possible surf smelt spawning habitat. You see, it's just one blue dot. And then this is after the dam removal. And we can see that's opening up a bit. Like there's a lot more possibility. There's a lot more suitable substrate for those surf smelt to spawn. And then after the armory was removed, it just opens up even more. So we removed a bunch of armoring right here, just east of the Elwha River mouth. And that delivered even more sediment, even more of that hydrodynamic naturally occurring process, which is a good thing. So some takeaways for today, kind of to recap what we've learned. Kelp forests, they are a dominant feature in our region. Kelp forests are really important for migrating salmon and forage fish. They're essential for the spawning of herring. Without kelp forests, herring would not be able to spawn on that understory eelgrass and kelp. The kelp forests, they have a very seasonal component to them, and not all kelp beds function in the same way. All three of these species are physically linked together. They are all linked to a larger geographic and hydrodynamic processes and water quality processes. So all of these things are converging, and the disruption of these processes, the hydrodynamic processes and the natural processes, can disrupt the habitat and their function. And when we restore these ecosystem processes, we have to think about restoring functions. So just like with the Elwha, when we think about restoration, we have to think, what are we trying to get back? We're trying to get back that historical kelp bed and the historical spawning sites for our forage fish. We also have to keep in mind that restoration is very expensive and it can take many, many years and is often incomplete. Sometimes we never get back what we've lost. So we advocate always for conservation of the natural ecosystem processes of our shoreline because it's essential to keep those intact to progress forward. And that's about it. We'd like to thank our supporters and collaborators, especially the North Olympic Library System. Thank you so much for hosting in the Olympic National Park. We wouldn't be here without you guys. So if there's any questions, we can answer those now. You'd also feel free to look at our website, and then our emails are listed above. But Anne, if you want to come up to help answer questions, that'd be much appreciated.
Okay. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand and Audra will bring you the microphone. That way people online will be able to hear your question and the answer will make more sense. If you are attending online, you can put your question in the chat and I will read it out. And one of our online attendees has typed applause.
Oh,
Yay.
I got him. No questions? Oh.
I'm wondering if you guys are ever studying or observing any species like lampreys or different eels out there.
No, we haven't seen any lamprey in the kelp forests. No, we see them in the lower river. We have a seining project, and so we're out sampling in the Elwha lower river Nearshore area, and we see them there, the amicetes.
I have another question.
Uh-huh.
Is there a sockeye run that's now reestablished going into Lake Sutherland? Because they were cut off with that lower dam, but I read
Mhm.
about that, the kokanee,
Is Dean here? There you are. That's one for you. I'm a coastal nearshore person, so I know there's been some change in the sockeye. We don't see them in the nearshore. I think we've only seen 2 sockeye over the entire 20+ years we've been sampling. But Dean, can you speak about the sockeye changes in the watershed?
I don't know the specifics to the question. The sockeye that they have observed in the Elwha, they've observed them in the main stem of the Elwha, and they have observed sockeye up above both dam sites. They're was thought that the kokanee in Lake Sutherland were a remnant population of sockeye that were anadromous. I don't believe that they've observed large numbers of sockeye returning to Lake Sutherland at this time.
We have two questions from online. So one says, so the baby salmon will hang out with their fellow small ones until they're ready to start predating larger fish. Then their friends become the bait. And then the second question is, salmon returned to the Klamath River this year for the first time in 100 years, but how do they know where to go since it can't possibly be the natal stream of any salmon alive today?
So there's that one great slide, I think you actually noted it, of that little tiny coho that had a mouth like huge. It's like half the slide. It's just that little coho mouth. And that's exactly what is happening in that slide, is that little coho has gone from feeding on zooplankton to just being big enough and hungry enough to realizing I can eat a herring. and it's a instantaneous shift. And so see the little mouth up in the top, and he didn't make that one, but when they make that switch, this is really fast. Our GoPros film at 60 frames per second, and this is literally 1 frame. So it's that fast. And then once they start feeding on the herring, and sand lance actually as well, then the whole behavior shifts and off they go. The second question on the Klamath, the fascinating thing about salmon is by their very nature, they stray. And they have a life history that abundance is their key factor. And so they have evolved to be able to deal with catastrophic failure, say, of one watershed or one system, and they can stray to the other. And so with the Klamath, that's exactly what's happened, is as that has become available, they've immediately come into it. We saw that also, and you may remember it with the Mount St. Helens. When there was that catastrophic explosion in the, I don't remember the name, what's the name of the river there? Toutle, right. So after the Toutle, everybody was horrified, thinking that the salmon runs would be wiped out. And in fact, the exact opposite happened, and they had, these quickly rebounding salmon runs. The interesting thing about the Toutle is they also didn't have hatcheries, and so they saw a really sharp increase in the salmon. Yeah, so I think we got one in the back, and then
I know that this study was relatively narrow, narrow in that it probably didn't consider the sea star wasting disease and whether the increase in the urchins have also impacted. I know we don't have kelp barrens out there, but how much impact has there been because of the sea star wasting disease?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. So this is all work that we've done. So it's not a they, it's an us. But yeah, you're right. The losses that have been seen in the kelp along the strait were likely associated to urchin barrens. And with the loss of the sea stars that would predate on those larval urchin or urchin larvae, we've had these explosions in these urchin fronts. And that is likely what's causing the declines that we're seeing in the Salish Sea region. And there's another factor that's likely occurring down in South Puget Sound, where we're having, over the last decade, there have been almost 100 restoration projects that have happened in the South Puget Sound, and that's also where they're seeing these declines in kelp beds. And so our supposition is, and nobody's looked at it, but they need to, is that those loss of kelp beds in Puget Sound are at least in part due to restoration of sediment processes from shoreline armoring restoration. That's not true up north in BC. They've also had kelp forest losses up north in BC, and those are likely due to heat stress. So all three, sea star wasting disease and resulting urchin barrens, you're exactly right. And then also, depending on where you are, restoration and heat stress. Yeah.
Question from online. Did you do any sampling of the kelp in the north section of Hood Canal?
No. And there's very little kelp. Overstory kelp, there's virtually none. That was actually one of the first things I worked on right at the beginning of my career, was looking at overstory kelp in Hood Canal, and there's very little. Yep.
Any more questions?
Good. Oh.
Need the microphone.
Yeah.
I think everybody
There's
can
Bob.
hear. Online, okay, so I'll use the microphone and not try to blow it up. Were you able to sample during the various tide and current cycles, or what happens? Does everybody just hunker down maximum current?
Yeah, it's interesting. And the kelp is such a flow mediating factor. In fact, there's a really excellent set of papers by Dave Duggins looking at flow mediation in kelp forests. And so while if you're just outside these kelp beds, you just get whipped away, within the kelp forests themselves, we're usually able to work no problem. Sometimes it's a little stiffer than others. And actually, that's where we often saw those sand lance. We're right on the edge of those rip and current places. And that's where they really like to be. But because we were in kelp forests, it usually wasn't a problem. You know, the trick is because these fish are so small and they are so aware of so many things that want to eat them, they're very shy and they're very fast and they're very skittish. And so that was our biggest trick, was getting to the place where we could observe the fish without feeling like we were having a big avoidance. And there's a whole technique to it that, do you want to talk about?
The technique of the snorkeling?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. The first question. Go.
Oh yeah, I get to answer a question now. Yeah, so when we're out snorkeling, we have to be really, really, really quiet and try and keep our feet and our fins under the water so we're not slapping around. And we also have to kind of wait for the perfect conditions. Like we want very little wave action out at our sample sites. So we also kind of camouflage ourselves. Our wetsuits, they have that nice green camo. So we blend in with the background a bit, but mostly it's about being quiet. Yeah, the fish pick up on that very quickly and they will scurry away. My first time, I think I scared them a bit too much, but you learn pretty quickly how to swim as to not scare the fish away.
The fish zen. Yep. Good.
Questions?
Okay, we'll take one more over here and then we'll respect the time of our presenters.
Thank you.
Two quick questions. Will this slideshow be online? Is there any way we could look at, there was a lot of information and I would really like to get,
Yeah, so we've actually recorded this entire presentation, and you can watch this. Give us till the end of the week to get it up on the library website. And then all of the ONP presentations from the last couple of years are on the library YouTube page. So you can watch this again or send it to your friends who couldn't be here. And that will also be true for the rest of the ONP presentations for the rest of the year as well. We will do the recordings.
and the other question, did you see much seal activity in the kelp forest?
No, not I mean, there are harbor seals that we will see intermittently. No, where we do see a lot of sea lion activity is during those whitewater events. That's if you get a chance, really do take some time to see one of those, because what happens is these fish come in mass and spawn, and then the sea lions come in mass to feed on the herring, and then the killer whales come in to feed on the sea lions and seals, and it's just a rodeo. But they don't last last long. They last about, I don't know, probably 24 hours because it's such a high stress time for the fish. They'll spawn and then move offshore, and then they'll rest and then come back in and spawn and then move offshore again. And they'll do that a couple, 3 times, and then they'll just go. So when the spawning, those whitewater events are going on, that's when we do see a lot of marine mammals. Yeah. So actually DFW has if you just get on Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, herring, I think it's the herring spawning, just Google it and all of their information will come up. And those, that season is just now starting. So they just, DFW has surveys where they go out and look for herring spawn throughout the Salish Sea. So they've just started detecting spawn up at Semiahmoo. It's early. It's really early. So it usually starts sometime, mid-February to March and then goes through June. But it's already starting at Semiahmoo. So it looks like it's going to be an early year. So yeah, and the biggest ones, usually there's at least one big set in Puget Sound. There's usually a big set, not as big as it used to be, up at Cherry Point, which is in that northern Puget Sound area. And then there are a couple sites along the east and west side of Bainbridge Island and then Hood Canal. And the one that we showed was in Hood Canal.
Okay, thank you so much. What a great presentation.
Good job.